I'm Margaret Cole, 58 years old, book restorer at St. Cene, a Laura church in a quiet corner of Virginia. Every Sunday smells the same here: wax, dust, and the faint sweetness of lilies half dying in their vases. That morning, I was sitting in the third pew from the front, fingertips still smudged with ink from the hymnal I'd repaired at dawn. The choir had just finished Ave Maria, and the echo was still hanging in the rafters when Father Anthony cleared his throat behind the pulpit. He began slowly, almost tenderly. There was once a woman who wrote in her journal, "I do not ask God to forgive me, for I have committed no sin other than loving the wrong man." The air shifted. Wooden pews creaked as heads lifted. My hands froze around the folded bulletin. That line. Those were my words. Written in the last page of my diary, the one I kept locked inside the restoration cabinet, behind a stack of parchment too brittle for anyone to touch. For a moment I thought I'd misheard him. The microphone hissed, amplifying the next words that sliced through the hush like glass breaking. And that, my brothers and sisters, is how temptation disguises itself as devotion. The congregation murmured, a ripple of disapproval brushing the back of my neck. I felt the heat rise from my collarbones to my cheeks. Ink under my nails began to sting. The leather of my handbag pressed hard against my knee, grounding me just enough to stay seated. Then came the sound, the soft flutter of pages turning, hundreds of them, as people opened their Bibles. It was the same sound I hear every day in the archive room, but now it felt like skin being peeled away. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I hadn't even written that line neatly. The pen had blotted that night. My tears had left small craters in the ink. And yet here it was. My private confession turned sermon material. I wanted to stand, to shout, to demand where he had found it. But my voice had abandoned me. All I could hear was the steady thud of my heart, so loud it almost drowned the echo of his voice. Let her story remind us that desire, when hidden, grows mold like any forgotten scripture. Someone gasped. Someone whispered, "Who was it?" Their words brushed my ear like gnats. I sat very still, afraid that if I moved, the shame would spill visibly out of me. I could see Lucinda, the new intern, sitting near the choir. She kept her eyes down, but her shoulders shook. Was she crying or laughing? I couldn't tell. The wooden floor under my shoes felt alive, trembling with the collective breath of the parish. I remember the smell-burnt candle wick and the cold tang of brass polish from the altar rails. Even the stained glass saints seemed to lean forward, listening. When the organ played softly again, I realized I'd been holding my breath so long that my chest ached. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted iron. Then Father Anthony closed the Bible with a decisive snap. "May she find redemption and truth," he said. And he smiled, that same pastoral smile he'd once reserved only for me. My hands were trembling when I stood. The bulletin slipped to the floor. The sound it made, thin paper meeting stone, felt like the end of something sacred. I walked out before the final hymn. Every step echoed under the high ceiling, and I could feel eyes following me, measuring my guilt. Outside, the wind cut through my coat. Bells rang noon, hollow and cruel. I pressed my palms together and whispered, not a prayer, but a question. How did my diary become his gospel? I have spent 22 years of my life inside the stone ribs of St. CSA, a Laura church. That is 144 manuscripts, countless hours of breath held over fragile pages, and not a single paycheck with my name on it. I told myself it was a calling, not a job. That salvation could be stitched into paper if the thread was thin enough, steady enough, faithful enough. My workbench sat in a narrow room behind the sacristy, where light fell through a slit window and dust moved like prayer itself, slow, patient, unending. Every morning, I boiled glue that smelt faintly of vinegar and bone, softened leather with beeswax, and mended pages that had survived more centuries than I ever would. Some nights I would stay long after the bells had gone silent, tracing the handwriting of monks who died before Virginia even existed. I believed, fiercely, that words could heal. And I believed that a woman's hands were gentler than any tool a man could make. "You touch the scripture as if you're stitching wounds," Father Anthony once said, watching me through the doorway. That was 15 years ago. He had come down to the archive for the first time, his cassock brushing against the dust. I remember how his voice echoed in that small room, reverent and soft. "Sister Margaret," he said, though I was never a nun. "You're mending the body of Christ one page at a time." I laughed then. It was a low, embarrassed laugh. "I only fix what's torn, Father. The rest was never mine to heal." He looked at me in a way that made my hands tremble. It wasn't love, not in the way people mean it. It was recognition of solitude, meeting solitude. From that day, he began visiting the workshop more often. Sometimes to bless the relics, sometimes just to talk. He brought me tea when the winters bit through the church walls, or asked my opinion on the phrasing of his sermons. Little by little, his voice became the rhythm of my days. There are things one doesn't plan to confess, not even to God. For me, it began with admiration, slipped into attachment, and hardened into something dangerously close to worship. I wrote about it because I couldn't speak it. Every night I opened my brown leather diary, its cover etched with a small, embossed key at the corner. A gift from a craftsman in Florence who said, "Every soul needs a lock." Inside, I wrote what I never dared to say, the tremor of his voice when he prayed beside me, the warmth of his hand on my shoulder when he blessed my work, the way candlelight turned his face almost human. Those pages were not sins. They were proof that I still felt alive. When I first started at St. Elora, I was 36, already considered past bloom by most polite Southern tongues. My mother had died 2 years earlier. My father never forgave me for leaving the family hardware store to play with paper. I had no husband, no children, no ring. Only a pair of calloused hands and a talent for resurrecting things that had been forgotten. The church gave me purpose, a roof, and something like belonging. And Anthony, he gave that belonging a voice. He once told me, "Every restoration is an act of faith. You believe what was broken can still be made whole." I had nodded. But in truth, I wasn't repairing scripture anymore. I was trying to mend myself. There was beauty in the routine. The click of my scissors, the hiss of steam, the sigh of vellum stretching back into shape. Some people find God in music. I found him in the smell of old ink. Every fragment I restored, I signed with a single initial. M. Never. Margaret, never, Cole. Just the one letter, as if the rest of me no longer mattered. Over the years, the parish grew. New faces, younger clergy, digital screens replacing hymnals. The old world was fading, and I, like the books I repaired, was only valuable when damaged. Still, I stayed. I stayed when they stopped paying me. I stayed when arthritis turned my fingers stiff. I stayed because walking away would mean admitting that my life had been one long act of waiting for someone else's approval. I remember the first time Anthony called me by my first name. He had caught me working past midnight, lamp flickering. "Margaret," he said softly, "go home. Even saints must rest." It was the first time in years anyone had said my name with warmth. I packed my tools in silence, afraid the moment would vanish if I breathed too loudly. That night, I wrote in my diary, he said my name as if it were prayer. Later, that same sentence would be quoted from the pulpit, dressed as evidence of lust. The diary was never meant to be found. I wrapped it in a piece of linen embroidered with the church's crest, a relic from the early days. Then I placed it beneath the wooden shelf where we kept unsalvageable fragments of scripture. Too torn to display, too holy to discard. It felt safe there, among the ruins. For years, no one touched that shelf but me. No one cared about the dead paper. But one day, a young intern, Lucinda, arrived, all energy and curiosity, with a phone camera she treated like a weapon. She asked too many questions. She said she wanted to learn the old ways. I should have been flattered. Instead, I felt a cold shiver I couldn't name. Sometimes, late at night, I'd reread my diary by candlelight, tracing the imprint of the key embossed on its cover. It had become my secret emblem. The key stood for everything I couldn't unlock. Anthony's silences, my loneliness, God's indifference. I thought of it as my covenant. If I couldn't open his heart, at least I could guard mine. I never imagined someone would use that key to open the door to my humiliation. Looking back now, I realize I mistook service for safety. The more I gave, the more invisible I became. The church didn't steal from me in one act. It took me grain by grain, hour by hour, until nothing was left but devotion on autopilot. When people say faith is selfless, they forget that even selflessness has a breaking point. So when I heard my words echo through that church, my private confessions twisted into a sermon on sin. I wasn't just betrayed by a man. I was betrayed by the very altar I'd served. And still, part of me wanted to defend him. That's the cruelest part of love. It survives even when it shouldn't. Sometimes, I dream of the workroom again. The smell of hot glue. The crackle of old parchment. Anthony's voice reading from Corinthians. In the dream, the key on my diary glows red, as if warning me. And when I wake, I can still hear him saying, "You're healing the word itself, Margaret." But now I know. He wasn't blessing me. He was rehearsing how to use me. I was 32 when I first came to St. Elora. Too old to be a novice, too young to be invisible. An awkward age for a woman with calloused hands and no ring. The room they gave me sat behind the chapel, damp and narrow enough that when I stretched my arms, my fingertips brushed both walls. The wallpaper peeled like old scabs. Rainwater slid down the inside of the window pane and gathered in a cracked saucer I used as a basin. Dinner was usually 2 dry biscuits and a cup of tea steeped in a tin mug that had lost its shine decades before I found it in the church pantry. When the weather turned cold, I slept with my coat on and used my toolbox as a pillow. It smelled of glue and leather, my kind of comfort. But I remember being happy. There was something pure about beginning again, with nothing. Every morning I would wake to the sound of bells and tell myself that the world outside had not yet touched me. That was the year I met Father Anthony. He was younger then, too. Only in his 40s, with hair still dark at the temples and a voice that filled the chapel without needing a microphone. The first time he came into the restoration room, I nearly dropped a stack of hymnals. He said, "So this is where the miracles happen." I smiled without looking up, only the paper kind. He laughed softly, a sound that felt out of place among the relics and dust. Later that winter, when the pipes froze and the ink thickened from the cold, he brought me a white cloth. "Don't let the ink stain your hands," he said. "Someone might think you're bleeding." I wiped my fingers on the cloth and saw the black smear spread across it like a bruise. "You don't know," I told him, "that ink and blood turn the same color when they dry." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at the cloth, then at me and said, "Still, one saves books, the other condemns souls." US. Best not to confuse them. I laughed then, but his words lingered. Those early days were quiet. The church bells marked the hours better than any clock. The air was always thick with the smell of candle wax and old varnish. Sometimes, as I stitched a spine or brushed dust from a margin, I'd hum hymns out of tune. No one heard. Or maybe everyone did and chose not to care. I was grateful for the silence. After years of living in boarding houses and moving from one temp job to another, silence felt like ownership. The church gave me space, purpose, and a roof that didn't leak much. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, I could make the past behave. There's one night that still visits me. A storm had cut the power. Lightning made the stained glass flash like open eyes. I was binding a Bible from 1862, its cover flayed open like an animal. My fingers were numb, the thread kept slipping. Anthony appeared at the door with a candle. "You'll ruin your eyes," he said. "I'll ruin my mind if I stop now." He walked closer, set the candle down, and covered my hand with his to steady the needle. His skin was warm, rougher than I expected. For a heartbeat, the wind outside paused, and all I heard was our breathing. When he left, he took the chill with him. I sat there staring at the small pool of wax melting on the table, realizing I'd been alone so long that simple kindness could feel like grace. Years later, people would call me naive. They'd say I must have misread everything, that he was only being pastoral. Maybe they're right. But that moment, that single brush of hands was the first time I believed God hadn't forgotten me. I wrote about it that night in the brown leather diary. He steadied the thread, and I mistook the stitch for a sign. I can still feel the indentation of the words under my fingertips. When spring came, the room behind the chapel filled with light. Dust motes danced like spirits. I saved enough money to buy a small radio, though the only station that reached us was an AM channel playing funeral hymns. I listened anyway. Sometimes I'd hear the choir practicing in the main hall, voices rising through the vents, thin but brave. I liked to imagine one of those voices was mine. I was still poor, still lonely, but I had a task that felt eternal. Each book I restored carried the fingerprints of someone long gone. I used to think that if I worked carefully enough, maybe some of their holiness would rub off on me. It never did. But the illusion kept me warm. There's a photograph somewhere of me from that year. Hair pinned up, apron smudged with ink, standing beside a table of open manuscripts. My smile is small, unsure. Behind me, a narrow window spills light onto the floor. Bright, blinding, as if even heaven wanted to read over my shoulder. When I look at that picture now, I don't see innocence. I see hunger, the kind that has nothing to do with food. I was 32, broke, invisible, and ready to give myself to anything that promised meaning. And St. Elora, with its bells and echoes and Father Anthony's quiet praise, offered me exactly that. All of it, and for a long time, it felt like salvation. Lucinda arrived in the spring. The same week the azaleas bloomed and the church roof began to leak again. She was 22, full of energy, and carried the scent of cheap vanilla lotion that clung to every room she entered. Father Anthony said she would help modernize the archives. Her task was to digitize the manuscripts, to make eternity searchable, as he put it with a proud smile. I didn't like the idea. Eternity, I thought, should stay bound in leather, not trapped behind glass. Lucinda worked fast. Too fast. Her fingers tapped at the keyboard as if typing were a race against God himself. Where I moved with reverence, she moved with impatience, flipping pages like shuffling cards. At first, I found her amusing. Youth always thinks speed is a virtue. Then, one afternoon, I saw her near my workbench, phone in hand, snapping photos of a small brown book, the one with the embossed key at the corner. I froze. "That's not prodigitizing," I said, a little too sharply. She looked up, smiling that nervous intern smile. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know it was personal. Wending, the stitching. I wanted to save a picture, to learn how it's done." Her tone was honeyed, harmless. I felt silly for being defensive. I forced a smile. "Be careful," I said. "It's older than it looks." But that was a lie. The diary was barely 15 years old. It was mine, not a relic. That night, I checked my workbench. The diary was there, unmoved. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible had shifted, like a thread pulled loose from a seam you can't find. In the weeks that followed, Lucinda kept finding excuses to talk to me. She'd ask about glue ratios, or about parchment bleaching. She complimented my handwriting, my patience, even my hair flattery that sounded rehearsed. Sometimes, when I returned from the chapel, I'd find my tools slightly rearranged, as if someone had been there and tried to put things back just right, but missed the rhythm. The magnifier would be a few inches to the left, the linen cloth folded differently, tiny changes that made my chest tighten. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, the girl was harmless. And Anthony had praised her often. Bright, curious, devoted, he said. Still, there was something in the way she looked at me like a person studying a painting they planned to restore but hadn't yet decided if it was worth saving. One morning, she came in humming. "Father said your journals are a treasure," she said. "My journals?" I asked, pretending not to understand. "Yes, the notes you keep about your restoration work. He said it's important to preserve your process." She smiled too sweetly. I nodded, though my pulse had quickened. "Those notes are personal drafts," I said. "Not for sharing." Her phone buzzed in her hand. I caught a glimpse of my own handwriting glowing on the screen before she locked it. Something inside me went cold. That evening, I stayed after everyone left. The church was quiet except for the soft breathing of the old organ. I unlocked the cabinet, took out the brown diary, and ran my thumb over the key symbol on the cover. It was smooth, warm from the day's touch. I remembered when I first pressed that pattern into the leather. I'd thought it would protect me, like sealing a prayer inside a vault. Now it felt like a target. I wanted to confront Anthony, but I couldn't bear the possibility of doubt in his eyes. What if he already knew? What if he'd asked her to copy it for safekeeping, he might say? So instead, I locked the diary in the lowest drawer and slipped the keychain with the real key around my neck, hiding it under my collar. Still, I slept badly. Every creak in the hallway sounded like a footstep. Every ring of the church phone made my stomach twist. One Sunday after Mass, Lucinda handed me a printed sheet. "Look what I found," she said proudly. It was a scanned excerpt of an old sermon draft, except it wasn't old and it wasn't his. It was mine, a line from my diary. "Faith is not silence. It's the noise you make when you still believe someone is listening." I stared at the paper until the ink blurred. Lucinda giggled softly. "Isn't it poetic?" Father loved it. He said he might use it in next week's homily. Giggle! My throat tightened. I forced a nod. I'm glad it spoke to him. She didn't notice the irony? Or maybe she did. When she left the room, I sat there alone, tracing the embossed key on the diary's cover, the edges worn smooth by years of secrets. It struck me that the thing meant to keep my thoughts safe had instead marked them for discovery. That night, I couldn't write. I just stared at the blank page, pen hovering. For the first time in decades, I didn't trust paper. And that was the beginning of the end. Sometimes sin doesn't live in the act itself, but in the hands of the one who reads what you never meant to finish. The Sunday it happened began like any other sunlight slanting through the stained glass saints, the pews already filled with perfume and expectation. The organ droned its opening chord. Incense curled upward in thin gray threads that smelled of dust and forgiveness. I was seated, as always, in the third pew from the front. My palms were still rough with glue, my heart steady in its routine. Then Father Anthony stepped up to the pulpit. His cassock was immaculate, his voice calm. "Today," he said, "we will speak of temptation disguised as devotion." A chill ran through me. Something in the cadence was different, measured, deliberate, too rehearsed. He unfolded a sheet of paper. The microphone caught the soft crackle. "A certain woman once wrote," he began, "I do not ask God to forgive me, for I have committed no sin other than loving the wrong man." The words dropped like hot wax. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then came the small rustle of curiosity, heads turning, whispers blooming like weeds. I knew that line. Every curve of the handwriting, every pause between the words. Mine. My throat constricted. Anthony continued, his tone deepening. "Let this serve as a warning, dear flock, against the desires that fester in even the most faithful hearts." The congregation murmured, soft gasps, a few pitying sighs. Someone behind me whispered, "Poor soul." I felt the blood rush to my ears. The air grew thick, heavy with incense and shame. Lucinda sat near the choir rail. Her head was bowed, but I caught the quick twitch of her lips, the faint, secret curl of satisfaction. My pulse pounded so hard that I thought the pew might shake. The wood under my fingers was slick with sweat. Each syllable he spoke landed like a hammer. "If sin had a scent," he read on, "it would be the smell of incense when you pray for the man you love to forget you." The line, my line, echoed through the vaulted ceiling. I tasted iron. My knees pressed together to keep them from trembling. That was when it happened. The world narrowed to the pulpit, the man behind it, and the words that were never meant to be heard. I rose too quickly. The hymnal slid from my lap, hit the marble floor with a crack that sliced through the murmurs. Every head turned. Anthony paused mid-sentence. For a fraction of a second, our eyes met. There was no guilt in his face, only calm authority, the kind priests wear when they think God has already taken their side. "Sister Margaret," he said gently into the microphone, Please, remain seated. My name amplified through the speakers, bouncing off the walls, filling the rafters. I felt naked. I wanted to speak, to shout that those words were mine, private, stolen. But the congregation was staring, rows of faces blurred into a single expression of polite horror. The air smelled of wax and sweat, and something burning in my chest. A woman from the choir crossed herself. A man muttered, "God have mercy." Lucinda's phone glinted in her hand. I heard the faint click of a photo. I bent down to pick up the hymnal, but my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped it again. The sound, thin, hollow, final, rang through the church like a verdict. "Let us pray," Anthony said quickly, turning the page. "That we may never mistake desire for devotion." The organist struck the next chord. The crowd bowed their heads. I didn't. I stared at him, the man I had trusted with my faith, my work, my words. I thought of the nights in the restoration room, his voice beside me, calling my labor sacred. Now, that same voice was using my heart as a sermon illustration. My vision blurred. The stained glass saints swam together, colors bleeding. I clutched the back of the pew to steady myself. In that instant, I understood what real desecration was, not breaking holy things, but turning them into weapons. When the final hymn began, I walked out. My steps echoed on the marble, slow and deliberate. I could feel every gaze following me, every whisper slicing my spine. Outside, the cold hit like absolution. I leaned against the stone wall and breathed until my heartbeat slowed. The bells started to ring clear, relentless, mocking. And somewhere behind those bells, I heard my own words still drifting through the church, no longer mine, dressed in shame. Sometimes sin doesn't live inside what we do, but in the mouth that dares to preach what we never finish saying. I closed the door behind me and let the click of the iron lock sound like a verdict. The archive room was dim, the single overhead lamp throwing a cone of yellow light across the workbench. Papers lay in ordered stacks, some mended, some waiting their turn to be made whole again. For the first time since I'd arrived at St. Elora, the room felt like a courtroom, and I was the accused. My hands moved before my thoughts did. I fished the heavy key from the chain at my throat and unlocked the bottom drawer where I had hidden the things that were mine. The brown leather diary with its tiny embossed key, a handful of letters, a spool of thread. The diary looked smaller sitting in the lamplight, its edges softened by years of secret keeping. For a moment I expected the room to fill with someone's voice, an authority to say, "Put it back, Margaret. This isn't yours to decide." There was no one. Only the hiss of the heater and the distant murmur of people on the other side of the stone wall, living their ordinary faith. I set the diary on the bench and opened to the last page. The handwriting was an old habit, short sentences, jagged at the edges, written as if I were trying to stitch myself together mid-ruin. I read the lines by the lamp's yellow breath. "I do not ask God to forgive me." And the rest, the line that had rung through the nave like a bell, still looked like a wound on the paper. I thought of the faces in the pews. Some had looked at me with pity, some with horror. Father Anthony had raised my private shame like a standard and marched it down the aisle. The humiliation tasted like iron. For a while I let myself be very small in my chest, a contained pain that had nowhere to go. Then the smallness turned to a stubborn heat, and the heat swelled into a decision that surprised me by its clarity. If they want to turn my truth into spectacle, I will decide which truth they see. I carried the pile of hand-copied prayers and sermon notes, work I'd done for decades, toward the little stove in the corner. The metal door was warm from years of use. The kindling smelled faintly of varnish. I fed the papers into the mouth of the stove like a sacrament being offered, one by one. As the flame took hold, the smoke rose, sweet and sharp, curling under the rafters. The sound of burning paper is unlike anything else. It is the sound of endings and the very definition of erasure. I watched the letters curl and turn black, watched ink bloom into nothing, and for a moment felt the clean, terrible relief of watching the past disintegrate. "You can't erase what people have seen," I told myself aloud. My voice sounded small in the room, but the words were firm. but you can choose what they remember. I set a kettle on the burner and let the water come to a shuddering boil. While it steamed, I opened a fresh section of the diary and laid out new paper cheaper stock, a little rougher. If I was going to play with fire, I would do it deliberately. I would craft a counterfeit confession, a bait so artful it would either make them recoil or reveal themselves. I had learned how to stitch a spine that looked like a relic. I knew how to age ink with a trick of lemon and heat. I knew how to write so a sentence would feel true, even if its intention was false. The plan made me feel both like a forger and like a surgeon. Precise, contained, clinical. I took my time. I wrote lines I knew would make good homily material sentences that hovered between sin and sorrow, phrases that invited moralizing. I made sure the voice was familiar enough to belong to me, but artful enough to be irresistible to a preacher looking for an example. I copied down half-truths and left them to bleed a little at the edges, so any reader could lay their own meaning into the gaps. Between sentences, I paused and listened to the scrape of my pen, the tick of the old clock on the wall. I thought about what I was doing. Wow. Deceit to reveal deceit. A lie to set a trap for a larger lie. There was irony in the method that almost made me laugh, if I had the breath for it. When the imitation pages were finished, I took a scrap of vellum and scorched the edges in the candle flame until they browned unevenly. I splashed a careful dot of diluted tea across a corner to simulate age, then pressed the whole stack under a heavy book so the binding would look comfortably broken in. Finally, I tucked the fake diary into the linen cloth I'd once used to wrap the original and placed it beneath the shelf where the unsalvageable fragments lived. A gambler folds an ace into his sleeve. I had folded a confession into the church's own shadowed place. I did not think for a second that this would be easy, that it would have a neat ending. I understood the risk. If Father Anthony liked sensational truth and not careful justice, he might find the new entry and gild it, broadcast it louder. If he suspected a trap, he might move faster, destroy my bait. The worst-case scenarios crowded the edge of my plan, but the worst case had already arrived. Humiliation had walked the aisle in front of me. This was, by comparison, a strategy. Before I left the room that night, I did one more thing. I took the real diary, its pages softer, the ink dented with time, and I copied a few lines, but with a twist. I wrote new phrases that sounded like me, but that would sting in a way my private words never had. I wanted them to be tempted to use my voice as a sermon illustration again, because the second time they reached for me, I wanted them to find a mirror held up. I slipped those lines into the stack that would eventually be found and maybe read, and then I locked the real diary away, deeper than before. Standing in the doorway, I felt the key warm against my palm, the small check of metal a reminder that I had once believed secrets were safe kept by locks and God. Now the lock felt less like protection than like a prop. I had to do more than protect myself. I had to act. Outside, the night was the same as it had always been. The wind moving through the churchyard, the crickets like distant metronomes. Inside, the archive smelled of burnt paper and lemon, of glue and the faint citrus of my ink trick. I had lit a different kind of fire than the one that had eaten my manuscripts for years. This time, I had put fuel to it myself. As I turned the key and locked the door, my hands were steady. The small, private rebellion felt like a first step. I did not yet know how the parish would respond, whether they would see the trap or walk into it, or whether I would find my name dragged through the mud again. But for the first time since the sermon, I was not merely the woman whose words were used against her. I was the woman who could make a narrative go where she wanted it to. If they wanted spectacle, I would give them something to spectate. If they wanted confession, I would teach them what confession could look like when the one confessing chose the terms. I walked home into the clean, indifferent night, the key heavy at my throat and the smoke of paper still sharp in my nose. The week after the sermon stretched thin and gray, like parchment left too long in the sun. The church bells still rang every morning, but their sound had changed. They no longer called me to prayer. They counted down. Father Anthony avoided me. When I passed him in the hallway, he found something else to bless. A candle, the wall. His eyes slid over me like light over glass. No acknowledgement, no apology. The silence between us became its own liturgy. Lucinda, meanwhile, found her voice. I saw her post on the parish's social page late one night. It's heartbreaking when the one who teaches holiness turns out to be the reason we doubt it. Within hours, the comments multiplied. Anonymous names, familiar faces. So disappointed. The devil works hardest in the faithful. Pray for her soul. I scrolled until the words blurred. Each line felt like a small stone thrown at my door. No one mentioned my name, yet everyone did. I shut the laptop and sat in the dark, the glow of the screen still burning behind my eyelids. The world outside was quiet, except for the whistle of the old heater. The quiet should have been merciful. Instead, it pressed against my ribs like a weight. At the archive, the air was colder than usual. Someone had opened a window, the smell of rain crept in. My tools were where I'd left them, but my chair had been moved a few inches from the table. Small things. Enough to tell me that nothing in this place belonged wholly to me anymore. The fake diary sat under the shelf, waiting. I checked the linen wrapping, the knot in the cord. Still untouched. The bait was in place, and I could feel the church tightening around it, like a body drawing breath before a cry. Father Anthony's footsteps used to be slow and certain on the stone floor. Now they were absent. The office next to mine stayed dark, blinds drawn. When he did appear, he moved quickly, like someone afraid of being seen with his own shadow. Once, I caught a glimpse of him through the cracked door, sitting at his desk, head bowed. His hands were clasped, not in prayer, but in thought. For the first time, I wondered if he was ashamed. Then he looked up and saw me watching. The blind snapped shut. On Wednesday, Lucinda came into the workshop carrying a stack of printed comments. "People are praying for you," she said, the corners of her mouth soft with practiced pity. "For me?" I asked. "For us all," she replied, and placed the papers on my table. The top page bore a headline, "Eighth Tested by Scandal." My hands itched to tear them. Instead, I folded the sheets once, twice, and dropped them into the waste bin. "Slightly quieter," I said. Her cheeks flushed, but she said nothing more. When she left, the faint scent of her perfume lingered, vanilla and smoke. It clung to the air long after the door clicked shut. Each evening, I walked the perimeter of the churchyard before going home. The trees were shedding, the ground slick with gold leaves. From the street I could see the stained glass windows glowing. Saints frozen mid-gesture, eyes lifted, mouths open in silent accusation. I caught my reflection in the glass once, layered over the face of Mary Magdalene. It made me laugh, quietly, bitterly. Inside, the parish meetings continued without me. Invitations stopped arriving. The few parishioners who crossed my path lowered their voices, nodded politely, and kept walking. Their restraint was more cutting than their words would have been. By Friday, I'd stopped hoping for explanation. What I felt instead was a strange stillness, like the hour before a storm when the air loses its color. I moved through my days carefully, as though sound itself might betray me. The diary's false pages waited beneath the shelf. I resisted the urge to check them again. Let them find it. Let them read what I wanted them to read. Still, I found myself whispering to the room, "Hurry up then." The echo came back thin, patient. That night, sleep would not come. I made tea, the same bitter black I'd drunk for years, and sat by the window watching the church steeple cut the moon in half. Somewhere out there, people were deciding who I was. And somewhere, my trap was breathing quietly in the dark, ready to open its mouth. On Saturday afternoon, I returned to the archive one last time before Sunday service. I straightened the workbench, wiped the dust from the glass cabinet, polished the small brass key that hung on its hook. Ritual motions, steady, calm, final. I whispered into the still air. If they've already written my sin, then let me write its ending. The words disappeared into the rafters, swallowed by silence. Like plats, the calm was complete. I could feel the weight of what was coming. It pressed on the back of my neck like a hand preparing to turn my face toward the light. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far away. The first drops of rain tapped the windows. Soft, deliberate, like fingers testing a door before knocking it open. I waited until the evening service ended, until the candles guttered low and the last of the congregation had slipped out into the drizzle. The church emptied itself slowly, like a lung exhaling. Only then did I walk toward the confessional, its small red light still glowing. A beacon for sinners. For 22 years I had knelt in that booth, whispering repentance through a lattice of carved wood. I never imagined I'd step into it to accuse the priest instead. The air inside was close, heavy with incense and dust. A faint draft carried the smell of wet stone. I sat down on the worn bench, folded my hands, and waited. A moment later, the door on the other side creaked open. I heard the shuffle of fabric, the scrape of his chair. Then his voice. Calm, measured, as if nothing between us had changed. In the name of the Father, and of the Son. Stop there, I said. Silence. The little grid between us glowed faintly from the light outside the booth. Ungrit, he said. I could hear the surprise. Or was it unease? Yes, I said. It's me. A pause. Then, quietly. This isn't the time for confession. It's exactly the time, I replied. I came to ask if you believe God forgives those who read someone else's private words. He drew in a breath. The sound was sharp in the narrow space. If those words save another from temptation, he said, then they serve his purpose. I laughed. Not loudly, but enough for him to hear the bitterness. So, humiliation is salvation now? You save people by killing one of your own in public? Margaret, no, I cut in. You don't get to say my name like that anymore. The lamp outside flickered, sending bars of light across the lattice. Through the tiny squares, I could see only a blur of his profile. His hand moving, maybe to adjust his collar, maybe to steady himself. You wrote things that could mislead others, he said finally. You crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed between a priest and a woman? I finished for him. Or between a man and the mirror he's afraid to look into? He didn't answer. I pressed my palms against my knees to stop them from trembling. You took my words. You used them to make a sermon about sin. But they were never about you, Anthony. They were about me. About what faith feels like when it's starving. You misunderstand, he said too quickly. You were becoming attached. I needed to? Save me? His silence was answer enough. I leaned forward, my voice low but steady. Do you remember what you told me the first year I came here? That every restoration was an act of faith. That what was broken could be made whole again? Yes. Well, I said, I believed you. I tried to fix what was broken. The books, the church, you. But maybe it wasn't the pages that needed mending. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the heating pipes and the faint whistle of wind outside. Margaret, he said finally, people were beginning to talk. You don't know what it's like. The weight of appearance, of reputation. I couldn't let gossip ruin the parish. I felt a short, stunned laugh rise from my throat. So you ruined me instead? I protected what mattered most. I let that hang in the air. Then, softly, and you think God is proud of that? He shifted on his seat. I imagined his hands clenching in his lap, the tremor he'd always tried to hide. I don't expect you to understand, he said. On the contrary, I whispered. I understand perfectly. You preached about temptation because you were tempted. You read my diary because you wanted to know if your name was in it. And when you saw it wasn't written as sin, you turned it into one. There was a sharp intake of breath from the other side of the lattice. The sound of a man stabbed by truth. That's blasphemy, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. No, Father, I said quietly. That's honesty. You should try it sometime. For a moment, the booth was utterly still. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a page from the false diary I had written. I slid it through the small opening at the bottom of the partition. Do you recognize this? I asked. He picked it up. I could hear the faint rustle of paper, then his breath catching. You forged this? I crafted it, I said. as carefully as I've ever restored anything in this church. You see, I wanted to know whether you'd use my words again, words you had no right to. So I left a new confession waiting for you." He was silent. "I suppose you found it?" Another pause. Then, barely audible, Lucinda brought it to me. I closed my eyes. "Of course she did." "I thought you were repentant," he said. "That you understood your mistake." "My mistake," I said evenly, "was trusting you with silence." I heard the paper tear. Small, deliberate. "I've destroyed it," he said. "I'll go no further." "Too late," I replied. "The newspaper has it now." The confession booth went very still. "What did you do?" I let the words fall slowly. "I sent them the same pages you read, the ones you thought were my sin. Let's see how the world feels when the sermon turns back on the preacher." A low, incredulous sound escaped him. Part anger, part disbelief. "You'll destroy the church." "No," I said. "You already did. I'm just making sure the ruins are visible." He stood suddenly. I heard the scrape of the chair. "This is vengeance, not truth. Truth rarely looks holy when it finally steps into the light," I said. "You don't know what you're unleashing." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "I think I do." For a long moment neither of us spoke. Only the faint drip of rain from the roof filled the silence. Then he said, almost pleadingly, "You'll regret this." "Maybe," I answered, "but at least it'll be my regret. Not yours dressed up as redemption." I rose, pushing the door open. The hinges groaned. The cool air of the nave rushed in, clean and sharp. Before I stepped out, I looked once more through the lattice. At the man I had once thought incorruptible, now sitting in shadow, clutching his collar like a man strangled by his own vestments. "Good night, Father," I said softly, "and may God forgive you for using his house to read a woman's heart out loud." Then I walked away, heels echoing on the stone, each step lighter than the last. Outside, the rain had stopped. The moon hung low, pale against the clouds. I stood under the eaves, breathing the cold air until my pulse slowed. Through the window, I could still see him in the confessional, unmoving, a silhouette pinned to the booth like an insect on glass. For years, I had been the one confessing. Tonight, he would stay in that box long enough to understand what it felt like to be trapped inside someone else's version of guilt. I turned toward home. My shoes were soaked, the hem of my coat heavy with rain, but inside me there was a strange clarity, a silence that didn't suffocate. The storm hadn't broken yet. Not the real one, but the wind was changing. And for the first time in my life at St. Elora, I wasn't praying for calm. It happened fast, the way rot spreads unseen until the fruit collapses in your hand. Within a month, the gossip had become gospel. Lucinda, bright and eager as ever, launched the church's new Faith in Practice podcast, a cheerful title hiding venom. Each week, she chose a moral lesson and read from what she called anonymous diaries of fallen devotion. The first time I listened, my own words spilled through the speakers, recited in her sugar-sweet tone. She said, "I still feel his shadow when I pray, and I wonder if forgiveness is only another kind of longing." She paused, sighing dramatically, then added, "And that's why the church must guide women who confuse passion with piety." The music swelled. Organ chords, a manufactured holiness. I turned the volume off. The silence that followed was worse. The next Sunday, Father Anthony stood before the congregation, flanked by two visiting bishops. His voice was calm, his tone pastoral. The announcement came halfway through the service, woven between psalms and blessings. "I am humbled to accept the call to serve as auxiliary bishop of the diocese." The church erupted in applause. I sat in the back, unseen, the sound of clapping hands ringing like hailstones on glass. He had turned my humiliation into a promotion. When the choir sang the closing hymn, I left before the last verse. Outside, the air was thick with spring rain. My reflection stared back from the wet marble of the church wall, pale, silent, uninvited. That evening, a letter waited for me on the workbench. The envelope bore the diocesan seal, Like sa. Effective immediately, Ms. Mess. Margaret Cole will take a period of leave to reflect on recent disturbances within the parish. This decision is made in the spirit of reconciliation and spiritual renewal. I read it twice, 3 times, each word heavier than the last. Reflect. Reconciliation. Renewal. In church language, those words all meant the same thing. Be quiet and disappear. For the first few days, I obeyed. I told myself that silence could be strategy. But silence has a way of mutating. It becomes what other people fill it with. At the grocery store, people I'd known for decades lowered their eyes. At the post office, 2 parish women whispered my name like it was a prayer for contagion. One afternoon, I overheard a stranger say, "Isn't she the one who—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. With nowhere else to go, I began spending my days at home, surrounded by unfinished work. Manuscripts I'd borrowed from the church library, fragments of psalms that smelled of age and dust. My hands itched to repair them, but I couldn't bring myself to begin. Instead, I listened. To the wind. To the distant toll of St. Rhee's Ast, Alora's bells. To Lucinda's podcast, which now had sponsors and an intro melody of triumphant violins. She had become the voice of purity, praised by local radio for bringing traditional values to modern media. In the 3rd episode, she read another passage, this one from the false diary I had written. She confessed, "I wanted to be seen, and so I mistook the eyes of a priest for the gaze of God." Her voice softened. "A warning to all of us," she said. "Sometimes, love is just pride wearing perfume." The line wasn't mine, not really. It was my trap. And now it was working its way up the ladder, whispered into the ears of thousands. Anthony's portrait appeared in the diocesan bulletin, smiling, framed by gold borders. The caption read, "Guiding the flock through the trials of temptation." It was almost funny. The church had crowned its own scandal. I received one more letter, this time handwritten, delivered by a young deacon who looked embarrassed even to knock. "My dear Margaret, I hope you find peace in this season of contemplation. What has passed was painful for us both, but I believe, in time, it will serve a greater purpose. The church has chosen to move forward, and I trust you will do the same. Anthony." I folded the letter carefully and slid it under the leg of my table to stop it from wobbling. It seemed fitting. His words were good for balance, if nothing else. A week later, the diocesan newspaper ran a feature on Lucinda's podcast. Her face, bright and earnest, filled the front page. Beneath it, a quote from Anthony, "The young must lead us back to truth. Sometimes renewal comes through the innocence of those who dare to speak." That sentence did something to me. "Innocence," he said. I thought of her phone flashing in the archive, of her grin as my diary pages lit her screen. Innocence, my God. By then, the emails began to arrive. Anonymous, of course. Some were prayers for my soul, others were far less kind. "May you find forgiveness for what you tempted a holy man to do. A disgrace to womanhood. How dare you call your lust love?" I stopped counting after 30. The words hurt, yes, but what gnawed deeper was the familiarity of them. How easily the world turns a woman's pain into entertainment, and her silence into guilt. Still, I did not respond. I listened. I watched. Every lie leaves fingerprints. You just have to wait for the light to hit at the right angle. One evening, I decided to walk back to the church. Not inside. Not yet. Just to see it. The building stood as it always had, its spire piercing the gray sky. Through the window, I could see Lucinda standing near the pulpit, headphones around her neck, recording something. A halo of light surrounded her, artificial and perfect. Behind her, Anthony's shadow moved, adjusting the microphone, nodding, approving. They were building an empire of virtue on the ruins of my reputation. For the first time, I didn't feel broken. I felt deliberate. Back home, I opened my journal. The real one, not the bait. I hadn't written since the fire. My pen hesitated, then moved. They've mistaken silence for surrender. They've mistaken shame for faith. They've mistaken my patience for absolution. I paused, then underlined the last sentence. Oh, I was done being mistaken. The next morning, the local newspaper ran a headline: Auxiliary Bishop to address parish scandal. Live. Broadcast Sunday. My breath caught. This was it. The moment he would rewrite the story for good. A public confession framed as heroism, a performance of virtue. But if he was planning to go public, then so was I. I retrieved the envelope I'd mailed weeks ago, the one to the Virginia Chronicle. The editor, a woman named Teresa Hale, had finally replied. We've reviewed the documents he sent. If they're authentic, we'd like to interview you before the bishop's broadcast. Confidential, off the record for now. I stared at the message, then at the folded newspaper beside it. Anthony's face smiling from the page. The time for patience had ended. That evening, I ironed the blouse I hadn't worn in years. Cream-colored, the one from my mother's funeral. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter from Anthony still holding up the uneven leg, and smiled at the absurdity of it all. For 2 decades I had mended torn things. Books, bindings, brittle prayers. Now it was my turn to tear something, precisely, deliberately, beautifully. When I turned off the lamp, the room sank into darkness. Only the faint red light from the radio blinked in the corner, pulsing like a heartbeat. I whispered into the quiet, "You wanted confession, Anthony? You'll have it. Just not the kind you can edit." By the time I lay down, I could hear the rain starting again, soft against the window. The calm before the reckoning. The air itself seemed to thrum with anticipation, as if the whole town, the whole church, was inhaling. I closed my eyes and thought of the flame in the stove weeks ago, the pages curling, the smoke rising like prayer. It was time to burn again. Only this time, I would decide what turned to ash. It was almost midnight when I returned to St. E. Alora. The rain had stopped, leaving the cobblestones slick and the air full of that metallic scent that follows a storm. I told myself I only wanted to retrieve a few tools I'd left behind. A brush, a jar of binding glue. But truth rarely dresses itself so plainly. The church was dark except for a thin line of light leaking from beneath the archive door. I froze. The cleaning crew had gone hours ago. Then I heard it. The faint, rhythmic tapping of a keyboard. I pushed the door open an inch and peered through the crack. Lucinda sat at my workbench, her back to me, the glow of the monitor haloing her hair. On the screen was a Word document titled Sermon Draft 12. Her fingers moved quickly, efficient and confident. I stepped closer, silent. The scent of her vanilla lotion clashed with the old paper air. My eyes caught the first line on the screen. It began exactly as I feared. There was once a woman who mistook her affection for holiness. Every word that followed was familiar, too familiar. She was copying whole paragraphs from the false diary I had crafted, reshaping them into a sermon for Anthony's next broadcast. For a moment, fury and a kind of awe mixed in me. They had taken the bait completely. Lucinda sighed, stretched, and whispered into her phone. "Father, I'm almost done. I'll send it to you before morning." So that was their partnership now. A priest and his mouthpiece, each laundering the other's lies. I waited until she leaned down to pick something from the floor, then slipped a little closer. The desk lamp lit the edges of my handiwork, my ink stains on the parchment beside her, the faint outline of the key symbol pressed into the fake diary cover. And then, faintly visible in the corner of the screen where she'd scanned my page, I saw it. The ghostly shimmer of letters written in invisible ink, only visible under certain light. "He who lies in God's name will speak truth before his face." The words were there, faint but legible, like a curse waiting for its cue. Lucinda didn't see them. She kept typing, her voice low. "If I finish this before the bishop's address, he says I can co-host the new radio series. Voices of Virtue? Imagine that." My stomach turned. The podcast had been just a rehearsal. Now they wanted a pulpit. I took one careful step backward. The floorboard creaked. Lucinda froze. "Hello?" I didn't answer. She rose, peering into the dark. "Father?" I slipped into the shadow of the doorway and held my breath. After a few moments, she shrugged, turned back, and resumed typing, The steady click of keys filled the silence again, each stroke another nail in the coffin they were building for themselves. When I finally left the church, I carried more than anger. I carried proof. At home, I opened my old UV restoration lamp, the one I'd used for tracing hidden text on ancient manuscripts. I placed one of the scanned images from the diary beneath it. The secret line flared up, glowing a ghostly blue. He who lies in God's name will speak truth before his face. A message meant for one audience only. If Anthony read that sermon aloud, the invisible words, treated with my reagent ink, would appear under the heat of the pulpit lamps. They would bloom across the paper in front of him, luminous and undeniable. For weeks, I had been afraid of exposure. Now, I wanted it, but not mine, his. The next morning, I returned to the archive during daylight, acting casual, polite. Lucinda was there, humming, cheerful. "Oh, Miss Cole, didn't expect you. I'm almost finished cleaning up your files." "My files?" I repeated. "Yes," she said. "Father thought we should digitize all your notes. Your words inspired him, you know. He said he wants to honor your contribution." I almost laughed. "That's kind of him." She smiled, oblivious. "He'll read the new sermon this Sunday. It's powerful. You'll want to hear it." "Oh," I said, turning away so she wouldn't see the smirk tugging at my mouth. "I'll be there." That night, I wrote in my real diary for the first time in weeks. The thief believes the trap is a gift. The liar believes his echo is the voice of God. But when the light comes, every ink bleeds blue. I closed the book and ran my fingers over the indentation of the key. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock, steady as breath. Outside, thunder rolled again, far away, patient, promising. I whispered into the dark, not as prayer, but as promise. Let him read it. Let the truth bloom from his own mouth. The following day, I walked past the church just as they were rehearsing for Sunday's address. Through the open door, I saw Lucinda handing Anthony a printed script. He looked up briefly, catching sight of me. For the first time, he flinched. "Miss Cole," he said, voice tight. "You shouldn't be here." "I came for a book I left behind," I said. Lucinda stepped forward, too eager. The bishop's busy. Ms. Cole, maybe come back after the sermon?" I smiled. "Oh, I wouldn't miss it for the world." They exchanged a glance. "Didn't know yet." That evening, I sat by the window watching the church lights flicker on one by one. Somewhere inside, Anthony was rehearsing words that would undo him. In a few days, he would stand beneath the warm glow of the pulpit lamps, preaching from a script copied line for line from my forged diary. And as he spoke, the heat would awaken the hidden ink. The congregation would see it bloom across the page like revelation. A single line, impossible to ignore. He who lies in God's name will speak truth before his face. And then they would look at him, really look. I closed the curtains, heart steady, breath even. For the first time since my humiliation began, I didn't feel hunted. I felt ready. When I finally decided to send the file, I didn't hesitate. There was no trembling in my hands, no second guessing. Only the cool, methodical calm I used to feel when repairing a book too fragile to survive a mistake. I attached the sermon draft, the one Lucinda had typed word for word from my forged diary, and composed a single line for the email. St. Elora's next sermon was written by artificial intelligence, not by divine inspiration. Then I signed it simply, anonymous. I added one more attachment, a scan of the page with the hidden phrase, glowing beneath the ultraviolet lamp. The letters burned blue across the image like judgment itself. He who lies in God's name will speak truth before his face. When I hit send, I felt something leave me, not guilt, not relief, but weight. The next morning, the headline stretched across the front page of the Virginia Chronicle, E-exclusive, local church's sermon allegedly generated by AI. Diocese, promises inquiry. I read it twice, savoring the irony. The words they had stolen to sanctify themselves were now the evidence of their own deceit. By noon, the town was buzzing. Radio hosts debated the ethics of fake holiness. Bloggers called it the machine-made gospel. Parishioners demanded answers. And Anthony, always the performer, announced an emergency service to clarify misconceptions and restore faith. Of course he did. He couldn't let the narrative slip from his hands. The church released a statement the same day. Recent rumors are unfounded. Our sermons are written through prayer and reflection, not algorithms. We invite all faithful to Sunday's service, where truth will be revealed. The word truth again. Their favorite costume. I folded the newspaper and tucked it into my coat pocket beside the old brass key, the one that once locked my restoration cabinet. It had become my talisman now, cold and heavy against my palm. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror and studied myself under the yellow light. 58 years old. Lines deepened at the corners of my mouth. Ink stains had long ago seeped into the ridges of my fingerprints, unerasable. I pinned my gray hair into a low twist and put on my dark coat. The reflection looked like a woman attending her own trial. Maybe I was. Before leaving the house, I wrote one last note, not a confession, but a statement, and sealed it inside an envelope addressed to Teresa Hale, the editor who'd first published the AI article. If I don't return after the service, open the enclosed USB drive. It contains the original fake sermon, the diary scans, and evidence of its source. You'll know what to do. I left it on the kitchen table beneath the clock, where the morning sun would find it. The night before the service, I walked once more through the empty streets. St. Elora loomed ahead, its steeple stabbing the dark sky. Light glowed in the sacristy window. Anthony, rehearsing, as always. Through the glass, I saw him pacing near the pulpit, papers in hand, lips moving silently. Lucinda sat in the front pew, phone raised, recording. The scene looked almost holy. Except I knew that every word he spoke came from a document built on lies. Felt no pity, no anger, only a strange calm, the kind that comes before precision. Tomorrow, under the heat of those lamps, the invisible ink would wake. And when it did, no explanation or sermon would erase it. Back home, I opened my real diary and wrote, "Every lie waits for the right temperature. Tomorrow his will burn blue." I slipped the brass key onto a chain around my neck. Its weight centered me, the relic of a life once lived for obedience, now reclaimed for truth. Sunday morning arrived with sunlight too bright to trust. Courtyard overflowed. Reporters milled by the gates, parishioners whispered in tight clusters. The Chronicle van was parked at the curb, satellite dish aimed skyward. I stood across the street, unseen among the crowd, coat collar raised. Through the open doors, I saw the pulpit draped in white. The microphone gleamed. Cameras were set up at the back. The diocese wanted transparency, they said. Anthony appeared, serene, dressed in spotless vestments. Lucinda hovered nearby, smiling nervously at the journalists. "We thank you for coming," Anthony began, voice booming. "Truth has nothing to fear from light." Not yet, I thought. But it will. Inside, I slipped into the last pew, far enough to be shadow, close enough to witness. The brass key hung cold against my chest. I traced its edges as if unlocking something invisible. Anthony held up the printed sermon, the one Lucinda had prepared. I recognized the faint crease where she'd folded it, the smudge of her vanilla lotion near the corner. "These words," he said, "are born from faith, not technology." He looked directly at the cameras. "We have nothing to hide." Behind him, Lucinda's smile flickered. Because she, at least, suspected the opposite. I glanced toward the rafters, where the lamps burned white and hot. My heart beat in time with their hum. Soon, the heat would reach the ink. I imagined the letters beginning to swell, invisible at first, then ghosting into visibility. Blue against white, glowing like revelation. I closed my eyes, hearing the congregation murmur, their rustling clothes, their breath synchronized in curiosity and judgment. "Yes," Anthony began to read. I didn't need to stay for the ending. I already knew how it would unfold. Within minutes, the phrase would appear. Alive, undeniable. A message not from heaven but from the hands he betrayed. He who lies in God's name will speak truth before his face. I rose quietly and slipped out through the side door, the brass key still warm in my hand. Outside, the sun struck the stained glass, scattering colors across the pavement. Somewhere behind me, a gasp rippled through the church, followed by a stunned silence that felt like thunder held in the throat. I didn't look back. The trap had been set long ago, now it had sprung. Sunday morning unfolded like theater. By the time the bells of St. Elora struck 10, the pews were packed so tightly that the air itself seemed to strain. Television crews lined the walls, camera lights blinking like watchful eyes. Outside, a sea of umbrellas shimmered under the drizzle, people pressing forward for a glimpse of redemption or scandal, whichever came first. Inside, the choir hummed a soft prelude. The smell of lilies and candle wax filled the nave. It was the scent of every funeral I'd ever attended. Anthony stood at the pulpit, his vestments whiter than bone. The embroidered cross on his stole caught the light each time he moved. He looked confident, almost radiant. The practiced calm of a man convinced that control was holiness. "My beloved parish," he began, voice amplified, round, steady. "You have heard rumors that seek to divide this house of God. They say our words are false, our sermons not our own. But truth is not an invention. It is eternal." He paused, letting the silence inflate. The cameras clicked, heads nodded. "And to prove that truth still dwells here," he continued, "I will read to you today from the very pages that have been so cruelly misrepresented." He lifted the printed sermon, my forged diary held high like scripture. The paper trembled slightly in his hand, but his voice did not. "Listen," he said, "and judge for yourselves." From the back pew, I felt the weight of every heartbeat in the room. The brass key around my neck pressed cold against my chest. It had never seemed heavier or more honest. The lights above the pulpit blazed hot, humming softly. I could see Lucinda in the front row, eyes wide, phone poised, ready to record his triumph. He began to read. "There was once a woman who mistook her affection for holiness, who believed her yearning was faith itself." A low murmur swept the pews, recognition, curiosity, pity. "But temptation," he went on, "wears the mask of virtue. And so she fell, not into sin of the flesh, but of pride. Let us learn from her." And then, slowly, the miracle I had engineered began. At first, only I could see it. Faint shapes blooming on the page under the heat of the lamps. Tom. Then others noticed. Gasps rippled through the congregation. The letters appeared blue, ghostly, undeniable. "Each who lies in God's name will speak truth." Before his face. Anthony stopped. His voice cracked on the last syllable. He blinked, confused, tried to turn the page. But every sheet carried the same curse, the same shimmering truth erupting from the paper like light breaking through water. People leaned forward, whispering, pointing. The cameras zoomed in. The words glowed under the glare, burning brighter. Lucinda's hand flew to her mouth. "Father," she whispered, "what is that?" He shook his head, stammering. A trick of the lights. But the microphones had already caught the panic in his tone. "You said you'd written this." A voice shouted from the pews. "We saw it online. It's the same text," cried another. The room dissolved into noise, voices overlapping, confusion building like thunder. Anthony's calm cracked. His hands fluttered over the pages as if he could smother the words back into invisibility. Please remain seated," he stammered. This is a desecration." I rose. My knees did not shake. The brass key swung gently as I walked down the aisle, each step a measured toll of reckoning. When I reached the pulpit, I lifted my hand. "Father Anthony," I said, my voice steady through the microphone, "if you wish to read my words, then read them all." He froze. The congregation turned. Sarah's word. "Miss Cole," he said, forcing a smile that cracked at the corners. "This is not the time." "It's the only time," I said. I reached into my coat and withdrew a small leather-bound book. The real diary. Its cover gleamed under the lights, the embossed key catching every flash. Asps rippled again. "You see," I said, holding it up, "this is the original. Not the copy you edited. Not the sermon you rewrote. This is the truth." Anthony's lips moved soundlessly. He took a step back. Lucinda rose, eyes wide, whispering, "Father, stop." But I had already opened the diary. My voice carried through the speakers, clear, unhurried. "I once loved a man in a white collar. He was God, but he was only the mirror of power, polished to a blinding shine." The church went utterly still. I could hear the soft whir of a camera lens focusing. Outside, a bell struck once, as if the building itself wanted to listen. "That," I said, "is the line you left out, Father." Anthony's mouth opened, but no sound came. His hands trembled on the pulpit edge. Lucinda's tears broke loose, streaking her mascara. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Yes, you did," I said gently. "You just didn't care." Someone near the back shouted, "Is this true?" Another voice, "You used her words?" The noise swelled. Anger, disbelief, shock. Anthony raised his hands for silence, but the authority was gone. The same voice that had once commanded reverence now sounded small, almost human. "You don't understand," he said. "These words were dangerous. I was protecting the church." "By lying?" I asked. "By saving it," he snapped, suddenly fierce. "People like you confuse confession with exhibition. I turned your sin into a warning." I met his gaze, steady. "You turned my pain into performance. You wrote about me," he said, his voice cracking. "You loved me." "Yes," I said simply. "And you proved why I shouldn't have." Crowd hushed again. I took a step forward, laying the diary open on the pulpit beside his glowing pages. The two texts sat side by side, truth and counterfeit, both illuminated by the same relentless light. "When you stole my words," I said, "you thought you could control their meaning. But every sermon has one listener who cannot be fooled." I looked up toward the cross above the altar. "Every word you spoke today, every lie you told, he heard first." The cameras caught that line. I knew they did. The silence that followed was electric. You could almost feel the faith in the room rearranging itself, deciding what to keep, what to burn. Anthony slumped slightly, the paper in his hands crumpling. "You don't understand what you've done," he murmured. "I understand perfectly," I said. "You taught me that every restoration needs fire before renewal." He stared at me, eyes glistening, voice hoarse. "You've destroyed me." "No," I whispered, "you did that yourself." I just opened the curtains. Behind us, Lucinda sobbed into her hands. A bishop moved forward, murmuring to the press to turn off the cameras, but it was far too late. The story had already written itself. Truth always travels faster than command. I gathered my diary from the pulpit, sliding it under my arm. Before leaving, I turned back to the congregation. Hundreds of faces, stunned, uncertain, some weeping. "If you remember anything from today," I said, "remember this. When people use your sins as sermons, remind them that every sermon ends in a judgment, and not the kind they expect." Then, softer, to Anthony, "When you took my words to preach, you forgot who your real audience was. Every sermon has a final listener." My voice caught slightly, and he's listening now. I walked down the aisle through a corridor of silence. No one tried to stop me. The brass key swayed gently against my chest, catching glints of blue from the dying light. At the door, I turned once more. Anthony was still at the pulpit, frozen, surrounded by the smoking ruin of his own certainty. Lucinda knelt beside him, whispering prayers that sounded more like apologies. The invisible ink still glowed on the paper before them, the message refusing to fade. He who lies in God's name will speak truth before his face. Outside, the air was sharp and clean, the rain finally gone. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. "Ms. Cole, did you plan this? Are the diary pages real? Is the bishop resigning?" I kept walking. The brass key was warm in my hand. When I reached the church gates, I turned to the cameras and said calmly, "Every act of faith deserves its day in the sun." Then I walked away. By evening, every network carried the footage. The pulpit lights, the glowing words, the confrontation, looped endlessly, dissected, debated. Headlines called it, "The Revelation at St. Elora." Some said it was scandal, others said it was divine justice. I didn't care what they called it. For me, it was simply truth. Raw, imperfect, finally unbound. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen. The brass key lay on the table beside a cup of untouched tea. Outside, the town slept uneasily. I opened the real diary one last time and wrote, "The day I opened the cage." The bird sang once, then flew through the fire. I paused, then added the final line, the one that had burned in me for months. When they turned my sin into a sermon, they forgot that every sermon ends with God as the last listener. I closed the book and let the silence settle. For the first time in years, it wasn't heavy. It was clean. I walked out of St. Elora without turning back. The marble steps were slick from the morning rain, and the crowd outside parted wordlessly as I passed. Some stared, some whispered, a few even bowed their heads, as if I were the ghost of something they'd just buried. The air was cool, but my hair still smelled faintly of smoke and paper. Inside that church, pages had burned, not with fire, but with revelation. I could still hear the echo of the bells behind me, ringing through the stone vaults. For 22 years, those bells had been judgment. Now they sounded different. Less like condemnation, more like farewell. The street was half empty. The news vans hummed, reporters murmuring into microphones. I kept walking until their voices became static. At the end of the block, the old bookstore where I used to buy ink and thread still had its "Closed" sign up. The window reflected me, an older woman in a dark coat, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, holding a brass key that glinted when the light caught it. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. Then I realized. She was me, finally unhidden. Back home, the house smelled of rain and glue, the scent of every life I'd lived. I set my diary on the table, beside the cooling pot of tea I'd poured before leaving. The key around my neck clicked softly against the cup as I sat down. My hands trembled, not from fear this time, but from release. Every muscle felt unstrung, every breath too deep. When I closed my eyes, I saw the scene replaying. Anthony's face, pale under the pulpit lights, Lucinda's tears staining her blouse, the words glowing blue across the page like justice written in flame. It hadn't felt like victory then. It still didn't. It felt like something that had needed to happen, the sound a wound makes when it finally exhales. That night, I lit a single candle and opened the window. The wind carried the distant toll of the church bells, softer now, diffused by the rain. I thought about how long I had lived in their shadow, waiting for permission to exist, to speak, to be believed. Freedom, I realized, doesn't roar. It whispers. On the kitchen table, the brass key lay beside the diary. For years, it had opened a cabinet. Today, it had unlocked my silence. The phone rang twice before I answered. It was Teresa Hale, the journalist. Her voice trembled with both excitement and apology. "You saw the news?" she asked. "They've suspended him. The diocese is opening a formal investigation. It's everywhere, Margaret." I said nothing. "You did it," she continued softly. "You showed them what truth looks like when it refuses to stay hidden." "I didn't do it for them," I said. "I did it because I couldn't carry their lies any longer." There was a pause on the line. The kind of silence only another woman could hold without fear. "Then rest," she said at last. "You've earned it." After she hung up, I sat in the quiet for a long time, listening to the tick of the wall clock. For once, the sound didn't count down to anything. It just was. A day later, I received a letter slipped under my door. No envelope, no name, only a single sheet of paper. "I'm sorry, I thought I was doing good. Please forgive me. L. Lucinda's handwriting. Careful, round, naive. I folded the note and placed it inside the diary, between two blank pages. Not as forgiveness, not as closure, just as record. Because even the smallest confession deserves to be kept somewhere. By evening, the sun returned. Light spilled through the windows, glancing off the brass key on the table. I ran my thumb over it, tracing the grooves that time had worn smooth. It was warm, alive, almost pulsing. For the first time, it no longer felt like a relic from captivity, but a symbol of release. I whispered to it, almost smiling, "We're done unlocking the wrong doors." Then, I slipped it into a small glass frame and placed it on the mantel, beside a faded photograph of my mother. The key caught the light and held it. Quiet, unflinching, enough. That night, I dreamed of the church again. Not of the crowd or the scandal, but of the empty pews after everyone had gone. In the dream, sunlight poured through the stained glass, and dust floated in slow motion. The same dust I had once believed to be holy. I walked up to the pulpit, laid my diary on it, and watched the blue words fade until only white paper remained. When I woke, I felt lighter. The story had ended, yes, but not in ashes. Later, as dusk fell, I stepped outside. The wind moved through the trees, carrying faint traces of incense from somewhere far away. It mixed with the smell of rain-soaked earth and something faintly sweet, like burnt wax. I tilted my head toward the bell tower in the distance. When the bells rang this time, they didn't accuse. They didn't demand repentance. They simply marked the hour. One life ending, another beginning. The sound drifted through me like a blessing. I turned the brass key once more in my palm, feeling its weight, its quiet certainty. And for the first time, I whispered the words aloud. The ones I had never dared to say within those stone walls. Amen. For me. Then I went inside, closed the door gently, and let the wind carry the rest away. A year later, the world had stopped whispering my name. That was the first sign of peace. The second was ink, ordinary black ink, warm between my fingers, breathing again in the light. I opened Ink Revival Studio in a refurbished warehouse near the river. The sign above the door was hand-painted, deliberate, unpretentious. Ink Revival Studio. Write your past in your own hand. Inside, sunlight spilled through high windows onto wooden tables lined with jars of pigment, notebooks, and worn fountain pens I'd collected from estate sales. The air smelled faintly of paper, lemon oil, and beginnings. On the back wall hung the brass key, framed behind glass. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "She locked her shame, then set herself free." I didn't hang a cross beside it. I didn't need to. The studio was small at first, 5 women, all older than 40, each carrying stories that had been told about them but never by them. There was Evelyn, who had stayed in a marriage for 30 years because her pastor told her divorce was sin. Ruth, a retired nurse who'd spent her life writing reports for others, but never a single page for herself. Nadine, quiet and thin as smoke, who'd brought a box of letters her husband wrote to another woman and asked if she could turn them into poems. And then there was Lena, the youngest 42, who confessed on the first day, "I'm not sure I believe in anything anymore. But I still believe in words." I smiled. "That's enough," I told her. "Belief doesn't need a name. Just a pen." We met every Tuesday and Thursday. No one called it therapy. We called it reconstruction. They wrote in notebooks, longhand, the way I had once restored manuscripts. Slowly, reverently, 1 page at a time. I taught them how to mix pigments, how to feel the rhythm of a sentence through the movement of the wrist, how to bleed emotion into words without apology. Sometimes, someone would cry quietly while writing. No one filled the silence. Silence, I'd learned, could be holy too. In the first few months, I often caught myself glancing toward the door, half expecting someone from the diocese to appear. An envoy of authority, a reminder that forgiveness required permission. No one came. Instead, new women found their way to the studio. They came by word of mouth, by rumor, by instinct. It brought their own ghosts, torn journals, letters never mailed, the weight of unspoken things. And I told them all the same thing I told myself the night I burned my papers. You are not here to confess. You are here to reclaim. Sometimes, I wondered what had become of Anthony. News said he'd taken a leave of absence for spiritual renewal. The church called it penance. I called it practice in solitude. Lucinda, I heard, had left the city, enrolled in a media ethics program. I'd wished her no harm. Maybe someday she'd understand that truth spoken for someone else's gain isn't truth at all. It's theft with a microphone. But I never wrote their names again. They didn't belong in this chapter. One afternoon, while cleaning the studio, I found a smear of ink on the windowsill, a perfect fingerprint. For a second, I almost wiped it away. Then, I stopped. The print felt like proof that someone had been brave enough to touch the world again. That night, I left it there deliberately, a mark of presence instead of error. At the end of our first year, the women surprised me with a small exhibition. They filled the room with their work pages pinned to the walls, each illuminated by candlelight. Stories of grief, of love, of faith remade. Not sermons, not apologies, just truth, raw and unfiltered. Evelyn read a line from her piece. God never asked me to be silent. Men did. The room went quiet, reverent. Then Nadine whispered, "Write that on the door." We all laughed, but we did it. By morning, the words, "God never asked me to be silent," were painted above the entrance in steady black strokes. One day, after class, a young woman lingered while the others packed up. She was new. Clara, maybe late 20s, hands ink-stained already, a tremor of eagerness in her voice. "Miss Cole," she said, "do you still go to church?" The question was simple, without malice. Still, it reached somewhere deep in me, where habit and rebellion still wrestled. I smiled. "Yes," I said after a moment, "but my church has changed address." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" I gestured toward the room, the tables, the scattered notebooks, the framed key catching sunlight. "This is my church now," I said. "And he sits at the writing desk." Clara smiled shyly, then nodded as if she understood something wordless. That night, alone in the studio, I reread one of my earliest entries, the line that had once cost me everything. "I do not ask God to forgive me, for I have committed no sin other than loving the wrong man." For years, that sentence had been used against me, turned into spectacle. Now it just felt human. An honest record of longing. I dipped my pen into the inkwell and wrote beneath it, slowly, deliberately, "I no longer ask for forgiveness. I ask for understanding, and I give it to myself first." The paper absorbed the words like soil taking rain. Every so often, a stranger still recognized me. At the market, on the bus, in the library. They'd hesitate, searching for a polite way to say, "I saw your story on TV." Amy, I spared them the trouble. I'd smile and say, "Yes, that was me." Sometimes they'd nod awkwardly. Sometimes they'd whisper, "You were brave." I never corrected them. It hadn't been bravery, it had been necessity. One spring morning, a letter arrived from the diocese. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the seal new. "Dear Ms. Cole, we write to inform you that St. Elora Church will be closed indefinitely for renovation. We understand if you prefer not to attend the final service, but you are welcome. The doors will always remain open to you." I folded the letter, smiled, and set it aside. I had no need to visit. I'd already rebuilt something better with my own two hands. That evening, I locked up the studio and walked to the river. The air smelled of lilacs and ink, my favorite mixture. The water moved slow, steady, endless. I took the old brass key from around my neck and held it over the water. For a long time, I hesitated. Then I whispered, "Thank you," and let it fall. It hit the surface with a quiet splash, sending ripples that caught the fading light. It sank quickly, leaving only circles widening outward, soft and perfect. I didn't feel loss. I felt space. When I returned to the studio, the walls were washed in dusk light. I turned on the lamps, their glow falling over the manuscripts drying on the tables. I sat down at my desk, opened a fresh notebook, and began to write. Not about pain, not about faith, but about beginnings. Ink Revival Studio. Year 1. Then the first line, to the women who were told their stories were too much. Write them anyway. I paused, listening. Outside, somewhere in the distance, the church bells began to ring. Their sound no longer accused or demanded. It simply marked time. The rhythm of a life continuing. I smiled, dipped my pen again, and wrote the final line of my new beginning. Amen. Written by my own hand. The camera light blinked red. That small, unwavering eye that had terrified me once. Now, it simply watched. I took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone, and looked straight into the lens. No makeup, no script, no priest between me and the truth. My name, I began softly, is Margaret Cole. Then I smiled. And I suppose you've already heard parts of my story, told by many mouths, none of them mine. I paused, letting the silence fill the space between each word. Outside the studio window, the river glimmered in the afternoon sun. The faint hum of traffic bled into the background. Life going on, as it always does, indifferent and unstoppable. If one day, I said, you hear someone reading your secrets out loud, don't cry. Maybe that's not humiliation. Maybe it's the world's way of hearing your real voice. For the very first time. I leaned forward slightly, the lens close enough to catch the small ink stain still living on my thumb. Because here's the thing, I continued. They can steal your words, twist them, frame them in gold or gilt, but they can't erase the pulse beneath them. That rhythm still belongs to you. Always. I folded my hands on the table, palms faintly stained with blue. For years I let other people preach my story, I said. They turned my diary into sermons, my grief into moral lessons. They thought I'd stay silent because shame is easier to carry than defiance. But they forgot something. Silence isn't absence. It's preparation. I took a slow breath and let the smile return. Not the polite one I'd once worn in pews, but something gentler, freer. I don't need the church to call it redemption, I said. I don't need forgiveness to call it faith. I just need to keep writing, in my own hand, with my own ink. The words came easier now, flowing like the river beyond the glass. I lifted my old fountain pen, the same one I'd used the night I rewrote my diary, and held it up. This, I said, is my new sermon. Not spoken from a pulpit, but from a pulse. A small laugh escaped me. Funny thing, after everything, I still believe in scripture. Only now, it's written by women who survived it. I looked down for a moment, then back into the lens. So, if you're watching this, I said softly, and you've ever been told your story is too loud, too personal, too dangerous to tell, write it anyway. If your truth scares someone, it means it's finally alive. I let the words sit there for a heartbeat, then leaned closer. Share this story, I said, not because it's mine, but because somewhere, someone is still letting others preach their life like a lesson instead of a testimony. Maybe your voice will reach them. Maybe it'll remind them that no one gets to write your sins for you. I paused, eyes steady, voice low but clear. Tell them. You're not the villain of your confession. You are the author of it. Outside, the sun shifted, a beam of light catching the framed key on the wall behind me. It glowed faintly, gold through glass, a small halo of its own. I turned, glanced at it, then back to the camera. I locked my shame once, I said. Now it hangs there, not as punishment, but as proof. Proof that a story can break you, then build you into the woman who tells it. I felt my throat tighten, not with tears, but with something like relief. So, I said, voice barely above a whisper now. This is where my story ends, or maybe where it finally begins. I reached for the diary lying on the table, its cover worn smooth by time. I ran my thumb across the embossed key and smiled. When I first wrote in this book, I said, I thought it was a prayer. Then it became evidence. It became fire. I looked up. Now, it's just truth. I closed the diary slowly, letting the sound echo in the quiet room. My story ends here, I said. But who knows? Maybe this is the first time my diary is being read by the right person. The red camera light blinked once more. I gave a small nod. Not to the audience, not even to myself, but to the woman who finally reclaimed her words. Then I reached forward, and with one steady motion, turned the camera off. The screen faded to black.